All right. Hey, Paul.
Hey, Fab.
Another episode. How's it going?
Good, you.
Good. Can't complain. Life is busy, so that's always fun.
Very busy. Sorry, my window's open. It's a very hot day here, and the air conditioning is not working yet. So,
Hey, boy. There you go. Problems.
first world.
Yeah, first world problems, seriously. All right. So today we are going to talk about the cold, hard facts. We're going to talk about data, and more specifically, how or what we should track our sales and marketing people on. I think it's interesting because I think we talk a lot about sales process and marketing activities and branding and all that stuff. But at the end of the day, it's still still need to determine what's working and what's not working. And so, and the best way to do that for now is numbers. So, Paul, I'm going to start with you. What should we track or measure our salespeople on?
Well, I was taking some notes while you were talking.
Excellent.
By the way, Fab told me about this subject about 30 seconds before we started. I'm lying 2 minutes. But it's a really good subject, and actually, it's the heart. It's at the heart of many discussions I have with many business owners and sales leaders, anyone who is looking to better the way they deal with their reps. And why do I say
Right.
that? What happens is that most people track results, and of course, you're going to track results. Of course, you want to know what the results are. But one thing that people don't track properly, and this is what a CRM does, is activity. And the way you track activity is important, but it's also what you do with the tracking. So if we're talking cold hard data, I think there's two things that you're tracking really. There's results and activity. And when I say activity, I mean all activity. I mean phone calls, emails, conversations. You want to know ratios. You want to know closing ratios, because what that'll help you to do eventually is you look at results, you look at closing ratios, and you can try to work with the salespeople how to. I'm going to use a fancy French word that sounds great in English. Ameliorate the situation. You want them to get better at. You want them to understand what it is that they can do better to improve their closing ratio. So,
Right.
Of course, I'm going sales right away, and I'm drawing away from data. So the data that we're looking at are phone calls, appointments, Zoom appointments. How far, how many, how far they're getting in their sales process, in each conversation. Is it a long sales cycle? Is it a short sales cycle? Is there a way to shorten the sales cycle? So you're looking at all this data. Data for data is useless. So it's really how you masticate this data. And it's funny because you and I will be talking to one of my clients tomorrow, and what I said to him is, he's starting off a small company. They're going to be hiring their first salesperson. So the idea is not to try to bite off more than you can chew first. So even though you can get all this cold hard data, make sure that you're getting data that you can use and work with. And the first thing you want to do is track people's activities, even before the results are easy to track. Really, did you make the sale? Did you not? That's the results are the easiest thing to track. What we're bad at tracking is activity. And start with the easy stuff. It doesn't have to be too complex at first, right? You can complexify as you go along, as how many follow-up emails are you sending? What's your follow-up sales marketing you're doing? What level of sales marketing are you doing? How much sales marketing do you need to do to get a warm lead? All these things become important. But at first, what I believe in as a sales leader is to track the activity to try to improve, or if someone's good, understand why it is that they're good at what they do.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know.
That's amazing. That's a really good answer.
It's a long-winded answer. Sorry.
No, but it's good because I think you're right, and I think we at least on the marketing side, or what I've seen from sales teams is like we get hung up on the end result, right? The revenue and or if you're in marketing, the qualified leads and whatnot. And like you said, it's not that they're unimportant. They are important. Obviously, like the business runs on revenue, so it's important, and profitability and all that stuff. It's important. But I think before all that happens, you're right, is the activity. And at the end of the day, the only way you can impact revenue is through your activity. And so when we're only tracking revenue, we're kind of it's what they call a lagging indicator, right? It happens after the fact, right? Like the revenue's target was hit or not hit. But when wouldn't it be nice to know, like, if we were on track to hitting it or not? And the best predictor of that is activity, right? If like a salesperson is doing nothing, there's a pretty much 100% chance you will not hit your revenue target. But if they're doing stuff, then there's a better chance of you hitting your revenue target. And I like that.
Yeah, and if you look at something else too, like, so your activity falls into probably some indicators, right? Because what you're talking about when you say, well, if I'm looking at this kind of activity, let's say you've got a large sales group and you know that, okay, when they're doing, this many calls a week, it usually generates about this many meetings and this many sales. So you've got some indicators, you've got some trends happening there, which is great, right? Because it helps you forecast what's going on. But in those indicators, there's economic indicators and there's market indicators, and those are important too, right? So if you're looking at results, you'll say, okay, all things being equal, let's say the uncontrollable, because there's the uncontrollable indicators. They affect you a lot, but they're uncontrollable. So the competition, the market, the economy, and you have to put those aside. When you're trying to see how it's going to affect the results, as a leader, you want to look at them, but you can't blame your salespeople for an economic situation. What you might do is ask them, say, look, it's a tough call right now. It's a tough sale. It's a tough game right now. So we're going to have to beef up the game by 10%, right? Because we saw this 3 years ago when this happened. Same thing happened. So we're going to, you base that, the data, the indicators are the controllables and the uncontrollable. The controllables are all the activities that you can do. So, sell more, do everything that you control. The uncontrollables are competition, the economy. What else? What else is there? I can't think right now.
Competition, economy. Those are usually the bigger ones.
So everything falls into there. So you're looking at these indicators. So, for example, if you're a bank and the interest rates go down, the prime lending rate goes down, well, chances are you're going to be putting out more loans.
Yeah.
Right? So your sales guys that are putting out more loans are going to do better because that's an uncontrollable indicator. So to tell you, okay, well, this is going to increase the sales situation. So all that to say that you have to look at those indicators, the controllables and the uncontrollables. As a leader, as a salesperson, you have to ignore the uncontrollables because if you let them affect you, they become an excuse.
Fair enough. Yeah.
So you just want to put them aside. So anyone who's tactically doing the work, the actions, then they need to get there.
Gotcha. And yeah, and like I said, I like that. And you're right. Like a salesperson needs to not get distracted by what they can't control. And fundamentally, like that's what we were saying at the beginning. Why you want to track those activities is because that's what they can control, right? The economy's down, they can still control how many calls they make, right? Like, or the economy's hot, they can still control how many calls they make. Like, and then you as a leader knows, like, okay, well, when the economy's hot, maybe it takes on average, 5 touch points to get a good meeting. Whereas when the economy is not hot, it takes like 15 touch points. Like you might know that, but ultimately, like that's what your sales rep can control. Like, okay, the economy's not hot right now. I need to do 15 touch points. The economy's hot. I need to do 5. Obviously, it's not black and white like that, but and I think that's why I like what you're saying about this activity stuff. And you're right. There's a lot of other things that we can look at. Like the pipeline velocity, how quickly the deals are closing, and stuff like that. But fundamentally, that all rests on one thing, which is activity, right? Your deals are not going to close if there's no activity, and I think it all stems from that at the end of the day.
Yeah, and there is another set of data that we don't that is very hard to accumulate. Maybe with some great AI, it's there, but the quality of your activity.
Yeah.
So what we talk a lot, what you and I talk a lot about, which is mostly what we talk about, whether it's sales or marketing, which is what you're saying. The questions you're asking, your sales process, all of these things. So right now in the cold hard data that we're accumulating, unless you've got some brilliant AI, it's hard to tell or it's hard to amass the data on the quality of the activity being done. Right. So if
Right.
two reps in the same company, the extremes, one person might need 10 phone calls to make one appointment and the other might need 100.
Mm.
So what's going on, and that's where that data is not as right now. It's not tangible, in most cases.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, like, like HubSpot does have their conversational intelligence where you can kind of listen to calls and identify the keywords and stuff like that. But you're right, like it's not available to everyone, and and it's yeah, that is more difficult to get, right? And then like analyzing quality, quote unquote, of emails and stuff like that as well. Like there's a lot of data that can still be got, but I think at the end of the day, just knowing that it takes Paul 5 touch points and it takes Fab 12, well, you right away know that there's something going on there, right? And you can start digging a little deeper, like what kind of calls is Paul having, like, or what's his approach, like, is it or is something going on in Fab's life that he's not, or is Fab not doesn't have the right motivation or whatever. But you just from the activity, you could tell that something's off.
Yeah, yeah, and off or different, right? So or Fab's selling to this market and it just takes more phone calls, and Paul's selling to this market and just takes less phone calls. So
Right.
there's a whole whack of. So what I'm basically saying there is you also have to be careful when analyzing the data, because ultimately your goal is always to create maximum efficiency or create extra efficiency, and sometimes looking at the cold hard data can mislead you. A lot of people have made mistakes just looking at data. I think of
Yeah.
I think of a few years ago when everything was going. Let's all put everyone in one big open room, sitting at a desk, and expecting salespeople to be just as productive while they created efficiency in the offices, but they didn't create efficiency in the work necessarily. So,
Right.
that's a very simple example, but there's data is definitely important, but if you extract the human factor, it becomes dangerous when you're affecting the individual. Now, looking at data at a high level when you're looking at masses is very interesting. I mean, it's fantastically interesting. Like when I worked for a big telecom company, we had some spectacular data that was so fascinating because we had huge amounts of salespeople, so we could look
Right.
at very interesting trends. And even when I was
Right.
in the smaller broadcast company before, I would look at trends and I could tell just from the trend what it meant for the next month's sales. And I was often very, very precise because we had over 20 or 30 people selling, and it was amazing how the data could act as a predictor
Right.
of what was going on because people had the same habits. So even though we didn't know all the habits and the actions they were doing, we knew what the data looked like, what the indicators.
So can you share a bit more without obviously
Um,
divulging?
yeah, I can tell you that at a certain time of year when we were looking at a forecast for the end of the month, I could tell within the first 2-3 weeks from the numbers that had come in where the trend was going to go. So if I knew, like, if by this date we had 15% of the bookings in, I knew that we were going to hit 100%. If we had 20%, I knew that we were going to hit 120%. So I really had a good idea. And mid-year or 3/4 of the year, I could tell you where the year was going to end. It was very, 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 very precise. Sorry, I've got something making a lot of noise here in the background.
Is that you? Okay.
Yeah, I don't know how to turn it off. So I apologize for that. You know what? I'll shut off. I'll shut off the website now. There, that should help. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
Sorry, friends. So I could tell just by where the numbers were trending in a year or in a month at certain times of the year where we'd end up because there was so much habit. And I could also tell you with individual deals with certain companies where they were going to end on the deal in the year, even midway through the year.
Right. Interesting, and that's fun because it's like let's flip over to the marketing side, which data and marketing have always had this really interesting relationship where a while back, like when digital really started picking up, the way digital marketers kind of sold their value was like, look at how much data, right? Like you can't collect any data off of billboards, but look at how much data you can collect off of banner ads and stuff like that. And data kind of became like their marketing's uh, you know thing, right? Marketers can collect data, and what happened then is that there's so much data that, and so much of it is irrelevant or not relevant for us. Let's call it that. It's relevant for somebody, but I think, and as much as I would love, on the flip side, as much as I would love to have like this one North Star, like, and this is how we're going to measure marketing on, like revenue or assisted revenue or number of qualified leads, like whatever we decide is the main KPI for marketing. There is some other stuff that we need to go track, right? Like, but that said, I like the idea of having one main goal, okay, qualified leads. Obviously, we've talked about this in the past, like having an objective definition of what a qualified lead is, but so that we can measure marketing on. But that kind of like revenue is a lagging indicator, right? Like, okay, well, we didn't have enough qualified leads. Well, it would have been nice to see that beforehand, right? And that's where you started. That's where, as well, on the marketing side, I would say, started looking at the activity. What can you impact? You can't impact Facebook algorithm changes, or you can't impact how Gmail now sends certain emails to spam, or you can't impact. There's a lot of things you can't impact. You can't impact Google's SEO algorithm changes or stuff like that. But what can you impact? And that's the activity you keep doing, right? If you send one newsletter every 3 months, maybe can you send more? Can you send less? That's the activity that you need to start looking at. And I was listening to an interview where somebody was talking about social, and that's the thing, social. Like, well, you need to do activity. If you're not putting on Facebook, well, you're not going to get the results. And so what's important for marketers is also to start looking at activity, like how much content are we putting out there? How often are we putting it out? And obviously you want to start looking at the quality. Like it's dangerous to just look at the numbers. Like it's easy to say, well, we sent off like 500 tweets last week, but like how we measure, like what's the impact of that? Like you have to be aware of that. But to me is also look at the activity, right? Like what's marketing doing activity wise. And I remember at a company I was in, like a bit like you, I would track activity and I would see like, oh, I think we're going to be low on the number of leads next quarter because our activity went down because things got busy or priorities changed. And if we don't have a lot of leads next quarter, well, guess what? Like salespeople in 2 quarters are not going to have enough qualified leads for marketing, and that would eventually happen, right? Like, and it's because I was kind of the data guy. I guess that's an excuse. Like, let's go change something. But same thing, right? Is like you can start seeing trends, right? Where you're like, okay, if you look back, and maybe social is not our biggest lead generator, but we definitely see a correlation between amount of messages or posts or content that we're putting on LinkedIn and number of leads being generated. So let's make sure we're keeping up that content and stuff like that. And when we have that cruising speed, right, when we're good at producing content, let's start diving a little deeper in terms of what quality means and stuff like that.
Well, and I don't know, what's your opinion on this? Because I find that when you look at data, just to stay on the data trend, I find that when you're collecting individual data in a small company, it's a lot more erratic and it's a lot harder to gauge what's going on and how the individual data affects. I find the larger the larger the pool of data, the more you can draw from it. And I don't know, and I'm not a data expert in any way, but I just find in my past that when I've looked at data, looking at the data of one individual, it becomes anecdotal, and anecdotal evidence is anecdotal data is anecdotal. So what works for one person might not work for another, but what works for 100 people, well, that's a little different, right?
And that's a big pitfall for, like you said, small companies, or even in B2B sometimes, like, marketing I'm talking about, because in B2B marketing, we often deal with smaller numbers. Like we deal with like 100 target accounts, whereas a B2C person is talking about like 100,000 potential customers, right? Like there's a big difference. And so you're right. Like I was talking to somebody recently and they're like, oh yeah, we sent out 4 emails and we have like a 50% reply rate. I'm like, Yeah, but you could send up a fifth one, and then your response rate goes down quite a bit if
Yeah,
they don't
exactly. It
reply,
goes
or
down
it
by
goes
five
up quite a bit.
percent. Yeah, exactly. So
Yeah,
and that's where I think data is great, but you have to be careful at how you use data. And I totally agree there. Um, this being said, in the next 5, 10, 15 years, as uh, as AI becomes more important, um, data will probably become more important, and sales and marketing will probably change a lot. Right?
yeah,
5, 10 years ago, sales and marketing were quite different, and they
yeah,
evolved quite a bit. Right? The access to information has totally changed sales. A salesperson 20 years ago also had to be an educator.
yeah,
A salesperson 30 years ago had to create interest and educate the person. So there was credibility, a lot of credibility that needed to be had there, and a
yeah,
lot of shysterism happened. So that that's where salespeople got a lot of their good name. Um,
yeah.
I don't know if you've noticed, but in the last 5, 10 years, you're not hearing that as much about sales. You're not
It's
hearing
true.
that negative connotation as much because the information's out there. So
Yeah,
sales has become a lot more empathetic. So the access to data, the access to information has also changed the way the perception and changed the way that salespeople and marketing do their work. Right?
yeah, that's true. And I mean, it's like you said, and I mean, I think you're something you mentioned early on, though. There is still a danger with data of as looking at it as the ultimate truth. Like, as much data as obviously, the more data you collect, the more truthful it can be. Um, but ultimately, like, we're still not dealing. It's not a scientific situation, right? Like, it's not a perfect A/B test, or it's not a perfect experiment. And and I see that in marketing a lot, right? Where people are like, we have no leads from social, so we're going to stop doing social. Yeah, but like, at the same time, is it really though? Like, are there stuff? Are you maybe measuring the wrong thing?
Yeah, you
Like,
have one writer
it,
of your social who's not doing the right thing as well. So you're right.
right?
It has to be. Data is useful when you're doing something that's very scientific, right? And where all the data points are measurable. Um,
Yeah,
but in marketing and sales, there's so many data points that they are measurable, but you need to have someone follow you and write it down and understand the whole sales process and marketing process and what the human brain reacts to. But no one has yet figured out, okay, this is exactly what you have to do in any marketing situation to make sure that it works, or this is exactly
mm,
what you need to say in a conversation to make things work, because at this point it's too complex. I'm not saying it won't happen in the future, but at this point it's too complex. So we don't have the capacity. Science has not caught up yet. We haven't applied the science yet to be able to really analyze it properly. I mean, you need to use science where it's intelligent, and in this case, um, the data science behind measuring what makes a difference is not there yet, and the numbers
right.
are too small.
Right. And that's why I think, like, and that's why I like going back. Like, yes, it's important to track revenue, and it's important to track all those metrics that at the end of the day impact the business the most. But then it's also going back to, well, what are we doing that impacts the business? Right. But then at the same time, also being, you know, aware that the numbers won't tell you everything. Right. Like we said, like in
Yeah,
marketing, like, is social really not that helpful? Like, maybe we're not good at it. Maybe, like, there's always that danger when people look at only revenue and they're like, well, social's not working, but email's working, so we're putting all our money on email, and that seems like a little simplistic.
yeah. If I was to draw an analogy of the science behind it, it'd almost be like you're going to test 100 different bicycles,
Yeah,
and those you're going to use 100 different people from a 2-year-old to a 95-year-old on each of the different bikes. Well, right away, your thing falls apart, and then sometimes it's on a windy track, sometimes it's the hilly track. So there's a bunch of data you're not considering. So your results or your data points are skewed at the end. It's not truly scientific. To
yeah,
really, and to say, like you said, that social doesn't work. Well, you're using the 2-year-old that doesn't know how to write, so it's
yeah,
obviously not going to work.
yeah.
So and I think that's whereas if you really wanted to be scientific, you'd have the same strength, you'd have the same rider in the same situation in a wind tunnel, on a flat surface, or everyone on a hill with the same tires. Then you're measuring the data or the differences.
Yeah.
But too many people, I think, in sales and marketing, use anecdotal evidence. Like you said, hey, this is not working. We sent out 100 emails and it didn't work. Well,
Yeah.
you're saying they all had a bunch of grammar mistakes on them, and they
or whatever. Exactly.
Hey, were they sent that? Were they too long? Were they too short? Like there's so many things that you need to evaluate to get to that point. Data points that you're not considering. So I think what we're both saying is, and you said it, and I agree, is that take data for what it's worth, but realize that right now there's a lot of data that we don't have that is not scientifically accumulated.
So I think if we tie it up, is like, yes, the data is important. You look at your main lagging indicators, revenue, pipeline, profit, whatever you need, and then go on the flip side of it and look at your main leading indicator, which is activity. How much activity are we doing? And then dive deeper as it starts becoming necessary, right? Like, okay, well, how many discovery calls versus prospecting calls or connect calls or whatever, like that we can start diving deeper once we start collecting the information, the high level information we want. That said, always be wary, right? Like, and I get like in a large telecom organization like you were at, the data is probably more interesting. But if you're a smaller business, okay, it's important to know what your salespeople are doing. How many calls are they making? How many, and what your marketing team is doing. How many emails are they sending? Fine, that's important. But also, you have the luxury of intuition. You know what I mean? Like maybe this is working, even though the number is not showing it. And let's find a better way to measure it, I guess.
Yeah, and I even think that sometimes the data you're looking at in large numbers, it's more correlation than that's what I'm looking for. It's more correlation than a direct effect on the result.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, just for myself, like I know I see a correlation without really measuring it between the number of messages I post on LinkedIn and inbound leads and referrals. The more I post, the more inbound leads and referrals I get. The more I stop, the less I get. And I'm not really tracking it. I could add like properties in my CRM to see where this lead came from and measure that. I don't, but I have the luxury of anecdote and intuition.
Yeah, and it's interesting. And there is a lot of intuition. There's a lot of superstition. There's a lot of what superstition often does is it gives you confidence.
Yeah.
So you do you say if I do 5 cold calls between this time and that time, it makes me I get luckier. Well, it's because you're probably it's a false. Well, it's a good confidence and it makes you confident, but it doesn't mean that they're directly related to each other.
Right. All right, Paul. This was a fun conversation.
Are we cutting it off?
We're cutting it off. It's been half an hour.
All right.
All right. Bye, everybody. Thanks for listening. And we'll see you next week.
Ciao, amigos. Saluts.